Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, the question most Canadians are asking today, the day after the summit meeting, so to speak, between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump, was the meeting a success? Did we move the yardsticks? Are we closer now to some sort of a trade deal that's going to show some benefit to Canada? Well, the short answer, and probably the most realistic answer to that, is we don't know yet. That when you're dealing with Donald Trump, as we've talked about in previous podcasts, and some of the quote-unquote experts that have analyzed Trump, well, there's a job for you. There's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind here. First of all, to get any sort of a deal with Donald Trump, first of all, it's got to be done face-to-face. You can't do it over the phone. So check that box. So the Prime Minister has been in Washington. Apparently, the meeting yesterday was at Trump's invitation. I guess they met at the UN when they were there for the General Assembly a couple of weeks ago. So check that box. The other thing they say is, well, Donald Trump has to like you to be able to make some sort of a deal with you. Well, based on what we saw yesterday at the meeting in the Oval Office, Donald Trump seems to like Mark Carney. He certainly respects him as a business person, respects him as a political leader, and Trump was effusive in his praise for Carney, calling him a great leader and a tough negotiator, and I'd like to, he could be my leader. You know, that's high praise from one of the most narcissistic leaders in the world these days, if not in history. But did it get us anywhere? Well, that's hard to say at this point. The bottom line here, there was no deal struck yesterday. Now, I don't know people like Pierre Poilievre are going to make a big deal about that, question period over in the Commons. But like most Canadians, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to what Poilievre says. He's just a little man making a lot of noise and not a whole lot of sense. And he'll do that again in this deal. The whole thing that we need to ask ourselves here is there a deal imminent? And we told ourselves, and we told you in a podcast just a couple of days ago, to manage our expectations. It would seem very unrealistic that Carney was going to walk away and say, we've done it. We got the tariffs gone or reduced significantly, whatever the case might be. That wasn't in the cards. And that's, I think, the expectation that most of us had going into this deal. But in the first few minutes of the meeting, in the press conference, so to speak, in the Oval Office, I think even the most skeptical of us kind of raised our expectations and said, whoa, maybe something is going to happen here. Because it was Trump himself, not Prime Minister Carney, but Trump, who seemed to raise the specter that maybe something was imminent. When asked about the deal, he said in response to a question that Mark Carney would walk away very happy from this meeting today. And the Canadians would be very happy with the result. He says, they're going to find out. I think the people of Canada will love us again. And that kind of raised hopes that maybe there is some good news going to come out of this. Maybe Trump is going to make some sort of an announcement that's going to please not just the Prime Minister, but the business community here in Canada. Well, it never really did happen. The effusive praise was one thing. Of course, they had the working lunch meeting, of course, when the cameras finally shut off. And there was an expectation that something was going to happen there. Well, it didn't. And of course, the Prime Minister did not hold a press conference after that. It was Dominic LeBlanc, his point man on these negotiations, that met with the press later on that afternoon. And LeBlanc stuck to the story that, they've made significant progress, and that's all good. The bad news is the worst case scenario is they could have just said, hey, nothing going on here. This was a waste of time. I guess it wasn't, but what we're looking for here is some positive action and some positive trade. But there were a couple of things that happened as I watched it yesterday that bothered me. It's great to know that he and Carney seem to get along. Carney, likewise, was rather effusive in his praise for the president, once again calling him a transformative president, who, as he said, extracted unprecedented commitments from NATO members on defense spending. And at that point, Trump actually interrupted him and said, yeah, and the merger of Canada and the United States. And Carney then interrupted him and said, that's not where I'm going here. Once again, quell that. And the fact that Trump even brought it up really pissed me off, and I'm sure it pissed Carney off, too, because I'm sure they've had conversations offline like, hey, drop the rhetoric. But it was Trump that has been raising it a kiss over the last couple of days. But the word that bothered me most of all, when Trump was talking about, we want to get a deal that's going to be good for Canada here too, he talked about some of the points that I think are the most contentious points here, and quoting the auto sector, of course, and steel and aluminum and the lumber sector. And he said that Canada and the United States have, I want to get his phrase proper here, he says that we have natural conflicts. Well, conflicts is a tough word. And it has a connotation right now that, there's a battle going on here. And that bothered me. And of course, then he asked Lutnick, his puppet, who's doing the negotiations here. Yes, we have conflicts. Well, of course, he's going to parrot whatever Trump says. That's what they all do there. But Carney turned it around and said, well, we have some differences. But, he says we can be competitive. And that's maybe a word that gets across the same point, but it's not as a blunt word as conflict. And that's always been the case. Of course, there are conflicts. We both want to make cars. We both have steel industries. We both have lumber industries, and we both have agricultural industries and dairy industries. But Trump characterizes that as being in conflict. And what we've always tried to do with Canada-U.S. relations, not just with this administration, nor with our prime minister, but past prime ministers and past presidents, is partnerships. And I have never heard Donald Trump use that word. Partnerships. And that kind of goes back to this whole mindset that Trump seems to have. He doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to win. That's his mindset through the whole thing. He wants to win. He wants to be able to come back to the American people and say, I conquered this deal. With whether it's the UK, the European Union, whatever the case might be. And if that's the mindset that he's got, then I'm skeptical that anything is going to happen here, because he wants to win. There's got to be about a conflict. The Canada-U.S. deal, even going way back to the auto pack before there was any Canada-U.S. deal, was about partnerships and saying, look, we can cooperate here, and it's give and take, and that worked very well for the auto industry, and it has for many, many years. But there are a couple of voices within the auto industry, most of it at the union level, from what I can understand, that say, no, we want it all down here. And Trump, of course, is parroting that. We want to make all the cars. We want all the auto parts to be done down in the States. We want all the steel to be made that we need here in the United States, and on it goes. And that's not the mindset that we've taken in the past. There has to be a recognition that there's benefit to both of sides of the border here to do these sorts of things. And that's how these deals have been born. Well, Trump doesn't have that mindset. And I'm skeptical, and now I'm a little worried that if he's going to maintain that mindset and dig in his heels that he wants everything to be American made, he says, go ahead and have your auto industry in Canada, but we don't want to buy Canadian cars. Well, Mr. President, yeah, they do. Americans have been doing that for years. But those cars that are coming back across the border as finished products that are being sold in the States, and by the way, most of the cars that are manufactured in Canada are sold south of the border, always have, probably always will. Well, I don't know what's going to happen in the future with Trump, but that's the way it's been. But those cars that have gone back and forth, manufactured in part in the States, some of the parts were manufactured in the States, some of the parts were manufactured in Canada. It's one of these, what they call an integrated system. And Trump doesn't seem to either understand that or doesn't want to even consider that to be an option going forward. And I don't know what he's playing at here, but what he's basically doing is he wants to build a wall, not a physical wall, but a wall between the two countries when it comes to commerce. And that's going to be a problem. And of course, the whole thing that he wants to use here, the weapon he's throwing here, is tariffs to try to deter Canadian participation in this. That's the roadblock that we've got here. He reiterated that. He did it in a nice way with a smile on his face. He wasn't being confrontational. He wasn't being the grumpy Trumpy that we've seen in the past. He was yesterday, but it was more towards the Democrats and Joe Biden as opposed to Mr. Carney, the prime minister who was sitting beside him. But nonetheless, it still shows the mindset there. There doesn't seem to be any sense of cooperation. Now, having said that, Dominic LeBlanc and others have said that, no, there is some progress being made here. I don't know exactly what that's going to lead to. We talked to Goldie Hyder about this, of course, from the Canada Council and others who are paying close attention to this. They feel that there could be a deal here, but it may not happen until the end of the year. Well, that's not good news for the Canadian economy and for the Canadian businesses and the steel industry and aluminum industry that are waiting for something a lot more, I guess, emblematic of the relationship and forging a new relationship. We want action yesterday on this. And I know that we're getting impatient, but businesses are laying off people, and it's having an effect on the Canadian workforce and the Canadian economy. And I don't know if we can wait until get at the end of the line. I'd like to think that the relationship that Carney and Trump seem to have struck here is going to move us further up. I know there are other trade deals that are being negotiated or talked about in the States these days, and I don't know where we are in the pecking order, if we're at the bottom of the list simply because we seem to be one of the last ones that they started to do these negotiations with. But I'd like to think that they can accelerate that and move us up a few spots so that we can get this deal done to the mutual benefit of everybody involved. Now, having said that, the other news that came out after the fact, and this is after Dominic LeBlanc had even spoke to the media, CBC was reporting that one of the topics that was discussed during this working lunch between the Prime Minister and the President was revival of the Keystone Pipeline, which would, of course, take fuel from Alberta and ship it down to the States. That was a deal it's been on again, off again for about 20 years. It was a good deal, and then along came President Obama, had some serious concerns about this, and they put it on hold, killed it. Joe Biden killed it. President Trump apparently likes this idea of a pipeline. They're not going to say, okay, it's a done deal. If they both agree on this, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's still a lot of hoops that have to be dealt with for that to happen. But it raises the specter that maybe that's a card that the Canadian government can play here. Yes, we will work with you. We will partner with you on a pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, and get that revived again. But, the quid pro quo here has to be something about relief of tariffs, because that's the takeaway here. That's what we wanted to see. That's what the Prime Minister wants to see. It's great to talk about, yes, we want to renegotiate CUSMA, and we're not even sure that's going to happen because Trump raised the specter of maybe just not even renewing it at all and simply making side deals with Canada, side deals with Mexico on a variety of different things. It's kind of going back to the 1830s and 40s way of dealing with world trade as opposed to what I think we've evolved into. I think that would be a step backwards, but, he says that may still be a possibility. But the thing here with us is the tariffs. We can talk about the deals with the dairy industry and some of the other side deals that are going on in so many aspects, because this is a multifaceted project and there's so many different areas to cover. But the immediate danger, the immediate concern for the Canadian government here and the Canadian industries are the tariffs. Prohibitive tariffs, the 50% tariff on steel, the ridiculous tariff on aluminum products and on lumber, softwood lumber. And again, it's unrealistic, I guess, to assume that these things are going to be eliminated, but there's got to be some tariff relief here. And that's what they're shooting for here. And I'm sure that's what Dominic LeBlanc is talking with Ludnick about on a consistent basis. The positive news, we're told, is, the Prime Minister left the next morning, although he did have, we're told, a working dinner with Vice President Vance. I don't know to what purpose or whether they're going to accomplish anything there, because I don't know how much sway Vance even has in these discussions. But, okay, that's still making a contact. But it's got to be done sooner. And we're told that LeBlanc and his team stay in Washington, and they want, because they've been instructed, we're told, by the Prime Minister and the President, both have instructed their teams, stay at the table, make sure this gets done. They want some immediate progress. Well, that's positive. But what we need to see here is some positive results. It doesn't have to be something grand, although I know Trump loves to make grand announcements, but immediately to simply say, okay, we're reducing the tariffs on steel and aluminum. That would go a long way, not just towards goodwill, but to give a positive sign to the industries on this side of the border that there is some progress being made, and the United States understands and recognizes the fact that there's got to be some give and take in these negotiations, because we haven't seen a whole lot of give from the United States, not just with Canada. But as we mentioned, he's installed tariffs on 90 different countries here, Canada being one of them. And I don't see a whole lot of give and take with any of those countries, including the quote-unquote deal that he's made with the UK and with the European Union. There wasn't a whole lot of U.S. give. There was simply take. And we're looking for something different here in our deal. And as we've talked about, and as Canadians seem to have accepted now, this is going to take a little longer. Forget this elbows up stuff. That was the right tack to take at the time. And there were some measures that were done at that time. Let's not forget that. Now, initially, the U.S. government backed down a little bit because all of a sudden there was a bond issue there, and the United States was in precarious financial position. Well, there's a great deal of evidence to prove that Prime Minister Carney and the Japanese Prime Minister at the time and European Union leaders were the ones that instigated that, and it was basically to put pressure on the U.S., and it worked. Money talks, and that worked. I don't know where they want to go on that now, but I mean, it shows that there can be some leverage that can be exerted here, and it's not necessarily going to be in counter-tariffs, but it has to be to get the U.S. attention. And if Trump doesn't understand that, certainly other people that are going to be around that table as negotiators on the other side are going to have to understand that too, that it can be mutually beneficial. And I think that's the key here. The Canadian side, including LeBlanc and the Prime Minister, have to at least in some way get the United States to see that, look, doing something good for Canada here can be mutually beneficial to the industries on both sides of the border. Past presidents have understood that. And Donald Trump seemed to even understand that when they negotiated that first deal. A lot of the stuff that he's been whining about here, like that, he still maintained it. And he brought it up again yesterday, the 400% levy in the industry to U.S. farmers. Well, that's not true at all. that 400%, yes, it did come up. And by the way, it was part of the deal that Trump signed himself. That 400% is a penalty clause in case U.S. dairy farmers exceed the amount of product that they put into the Canadian market. Well, nobody's ever come close to that, so it's never even been done. It's kind of like, worst case scenario. If you guys really step over the line, there's a penalty for that. And Trump signed off on that. Now, all of a sudden, he says it's a terrible deal. Well, if it was such a terrible deal, why did he sign off on it? And it's never even happened. But he's using those sorts of scenarios, I guess, to try to paint a picture here that his farmers are being unfairly treated. Well, that's not the case at all. So you've got to get over that rhetoric and find something that's going to be mutually compatible. And I'd like to think that there's some progress. Dominic LeBlanc says there has been. But what we're looking for here right now is some wins. We need somebody in front of the microphones on both sides to come up together and said, here's what we've got. A relief for the steel industry, whatever the case might be, something. We're looking, the Canadian manufacturers, the Canadian steel industry, we're all looking for something to say, ha-ha. It may not be the whole thing, but at least it's a piece of the pie that we can settle on. And rest assured that there's a message here that they're willing to work with us on some of these issues. And we're not there. They like each other. That's great. Now we need to see just how that's going to translate into something positive for Canada. And we're not there yet, sadly. But maybe, by the time we even do this podcast, there could be news. I mean, LeBlanc and his team are working with a Ludnick team in Washington as we speak. But the ultimate goal here is it's got to be Donald Trump that seems to understand that this is going to work. And we need to convince him, and we need the Americans on the other side of the table to convince the president that working with Canada and maybe showing some relief here is what's going to actually happen. So was it a positive sign? Yes. Is it going to pay dividends? The fact is, we don't know yet, and we're waiting, and we're still optimistic and still hopeful. And as long as we've got that optimism and that hope, there's still a chance that maybe this is going to work out in the end. Maybe not as quickly as we wanted, but as we've always said, we don't want a fast deal. We want a good deal for Canada. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Always a pleasure. If you're on YouTube watching it, good to have you with us. Thanks so much. Hit that notification bell to make sure that you spread the word on this. Thank you to everybody who's subscribing, too. We're getting more and more people jumping on board and supporting us, and that's great. There's a lot going on here, and we need to talk about this and create this dialogue, and we need to be able to sift through the bombast here to try to get to the facts so the Canadians have an understanding as to what's going on. And your support through subscriptions will help us to do that work. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing the program. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.